You know, usually when we talk about a diagnosis, whether it's medical or even just fixing a broken down car, there's this really ingrained expectation of precision. It feels like engineering.
Right, it's very mechanical.
Exactly. You fall off your bike, you break your arm, you go to the hospital, the doctor puts your arm under the machine, the x-ray lights up, and it shows that stark, jagged white line across the humerus. And the doctor just points a pen at the screen and says, there it is. That's the problem.
It is honestly incredibly satisfying on a psychological level. It's binary.
Yeah.
The bone is broken or the bone is intact.
Yeah, broken or not broken, it's clean. It's a fact you can visually process and almost like hold in your hand. And we crave that kind of certainty in every aspect of our lives, not just with physical injury.
Oh, absolutely. We like things to be visible, to be categorized, to be isolated. We fundamentally want an x-ray machine for reality itself. We want to be able to point at a screen and say, you know, that is me. That is my problem. And that is the exact solution.
But then you step into the world of Madhyamaka philosophy. You step into the deep foundational architecture of how the human mind actually constructs reality. And suddenly you realize that X-ray machine is completely useless.
It's worse than useless.
Yeah, it's not just malfunctioning. It is the completely wrong tool for the universe we actually inhabit. Because we are looking at a diagnostic landscape of the self that isn't just murky. It actively resists being photographed.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. Because what we're trying to take a picture of might not actually be there in the way the camera is built to capture it. The mind is a machine designed to see solid objects. But reality, at least according to this framework, operates entirely differently.
And that is exactly the paradigm-shifting territory we are exploring today. We are jumping straight into Chapter 18 of Nāgārjuna's Mūlamadhyamakakārikā.
A massive text.
Truly massive. And for you listening, we are treating you as the peer you are. You've been on this incredibly dense intellectual journey through the text with us.
You already navigated the brutal deconstruction of inherent existence, that concept of svabhava, back in Chapter 15.
Right, and you wrestled with the sheer, relentless mechanics of karma and causal chains in Chapter 17. So you have the exact vocabulary and the conceptual stamina required for the profound, really floor-dropping shift that happens in this specific chapter.
Chapter 18 is titled An Analysis of the Individual Self, or in Sanskrit, ātma. And the mission we are undertaking today is highly specific, incredibly rigorous, and honestly, a bit dangerous to the ego.
I would say very dangerous.
Yeah, fair enough. We are going to apply an 11-step Madhyamaka reasoning process to completely dismantle the concept of the self.
Step by step.
Exactly. We are going after the owner of the experience, we are going after its possessions, which are the 5 aggregates, and we are going to deconstruct the ultimate illusion of duality that fuels basically every single anxiety you have ever felt.
But before we make our first cut with Nāgārjuna's logical scalpel, we need to quickly address the tools we are using. We aren't just looking at one English translation of these 12 verses, because that would be a mistake.
No, we absolutely cannot rely on a single translator here. Nāgārjuna's Sanskrit is famously compressed. It's almost mathematical in its brevity.
Like an equation.
Exactly like an equation. A single word can carry an entire philosophical ecosystem. So to ensure we are actually capturing the mechanics of his argument, we are triangulating across 4 major, highly respected translations.
Right. So we have J. Garfield, the Padmakara Translation Group, Stephen Batchelor, and Frederick Strang.
And each of them brings a slightly different lens to the text. And by overlaying them, we get this incredible 3-dimensional view of what Nāgārjuna is actually doing to the mind.
So let's get right into the mechanics of it. Step 1 of our framework. If we're going to dismantle the self, we first have to map out exactly how the mind constructs this hallucination of reality in the first place. Nāgārjuna argues that the mind essentially operates as a factory that produces reality through triads and dualities.
Right, so if we pull the thread from our previous discussion on karma, the mind fundamentally operates by creating a triad of karma production. Think of it as 3 distinct but entirely codependent spheres.
Okay, lay them out for us.
Sphere 1 is the actor, the owner, the acquirer. This is what we colloquially call the self or the I. Sphere 2 is the action itself, the ownership, the process of acquiring. And Sphere 3 is the result, the possession, the acquired.
Okay, let me just pause you there and ground this for a second. If I'm just walking down the street and I buy a cup of coffee, I am the actor.
Right.
The physical transaction of handing over $5 and taking the cup is the action, the acquiring, and the coffee is the possession. But in Buddhist terms, Nāgārjuna isn't just talking about coffee, is he? The possessions are the 5 aggregates.
Precisely. The third sphere, the result or the acquired, is fundamentally the 5 aggregates or skandhas. These are the components that make up a sentient being.
Right, so we have form, which is your physical body.
Feeling, which is your sensory reactions, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral.
Perception, how you recognize and label things.
Mental formations, your volitions, habits, prejudices. And finally, consciousness, your base awareness.
So the mind constantly generates a sentence, essentially. Like, I, the actor, am experiencing the action, my anger, which is the possession or aggregate.
Exactly. It's subject, verb, object. It is the absolute basic grammar of human perception. You cannot form a thought without assuming those 3 spheres exist independently.
And from that foundational triad, the mind spawns this massive web of dyads, right? Pairs of opposites that basically govern our entire worldview.
Oh, yeah. We pit the self against the no-self. We pit me against mine. Yeah. We create the binary of existence versus non-existence, eternalism versus nihilism, and ultimately the granddaddy of them all.
Samsara versus nirvana.
Exactly. The cycle of suffering versus liberation.
Okay, so if the mind absolutely insists on splitting reality into me and my stuff, how do we actually prove that's a hallucination? Because, to me, it feels incredibly real. My body feels like mine. My anxiety feels like mine.
It's very convincing.
It is. And Nāgārjuna doesn't just ask us to take his word for it, right? He doesn't say, just blindly believe it's an illusion. He traps the mind using logic. This is step 2.
Yes. He uses a rigorous logical device called the tetralemma. Now, in Western logic, we usually deal with a dilemma, right? It's either A or B, true or false.
Very binary.
But the tetralemma expands this into 4 corners. Is it A? Is it B? Is it both A and B? Is it neither A nor B?
So he takes these 3 spheres, the owner, the acquiring, and the possessions, and just runs them through this 4-cornered gauntlet.
Exactly. He demonstrates that these spheres cannot exist in any of the extreme ways the mind desperately tries to categorize them. They can't be existent, non-existent, both, or neither. They can't be different, identical, both, or neither.
Let's actually look at the text to see how he executes this, because it's brilliant.
Yeah.
We are looking at verse 1. I'm going to synthesize Garfield and Batchelor here.
Go for it.
Nāgārjuna writes, if the self were identical to the aggregates, it would be subject to birth and decay. If it were different from the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates.
Okay, so let's break down that first logical corner, which is identity. Are the self and the aggregates identical?
Right, because the mind often wants to say, yes, I am my body, I am my brain, I am my feelings.
But Nāgārjuna points out the fatal flaw in that. The 5 aggregates are in a state of constant, violent flux. Your cells are dying and replacing themselves. Your feeling of happiness arises for 3 seconds, vanishes, and is replaced by a feeling of annoyance because your shoe is untied.
Right, right. If the I is exactly the same thing as my changing feelings, then the I must be constantly dying and being reborn 100 times a minute. But that utterly contradicts the psychological feeling of a continuous, stable self. I feel like the same person who went to sleep last night, even though my thoughts and my physical state are completely different. So identity fails. The self cannot be identical to the aggregates.
So instinctively, the human ego panics and runs to the second logical corner, which is difference.
The fallback plan.
Exactly. The mind says, okay, fine. The self is not the body. It is not the changing feelings. The self is a soul. It's this immortal, independent observer sitting in a dark theater right behind the eyes, watching the screen of the aggregates play out.
And this is exactly what the non-Buddhist schools in India were arguing, right? And honestly, it's what most of Western philosophy and religion assumes. Dualism.
Yeah, it's a very common trap. But Nāgārjuna drops a hammer on dualism right here. If the self is completely different from the aggregates of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, what is left?
Just a void.
Right. It would lack their characteristics entirely. It would have no physical form to interact with the world. It could feel no feeling. It would have no perception to see the world.
It would be completely imperceptible, functionally irrelevant, and totally unable to interact with the body. You wouldn't even have the consciousness to know it was there. Hang on, I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the severity of this. If I argue that myself is a separate, pure observer, like a ghost driving a meat skeleton.
Good visual.
Thanks. Nāgārjuna is saying that a completely immaterial ghost has no mechanism to turn the steering wheel. If it's truly independent and different, it can't interact with the dependent physical world.
Precisely. If it's independent, it cannot engage in the dependent realm of cause and effect. It couldn't acquire karma. It couldn't experience suffering. The difference argument falls apart because an absolutely separate self is a useless, non-interactive concept.
It's a brilliant trap. If the self is the same as the aggregates, it dies every second. If it's different, it doesn't exist in any meaningful, interactive way.
And if you try to say it's both identical and different, well, that's just a logical contradiction. You can't be entirely the same and entirely different.
And saying it is neither is equally absurd and leaves you with literally nothing. So the tetralemma proves the self, and the aggregates cannot inherently be existent. They cannot be non-existent, both or neither. They aren't permanent, they are impermanent, both or neither.
And once you shatter the inherently existent me, you instantly vaporize the inherently existent mind.
The actor and the possessions fall together.
Exactly. Which brings us to verse 2. The Madhyamaka translation group captures the poetry of this beautifully. They write, "If the I has no existence, how can there be such a thing as mine? When I and mine are laid to rest, there will be no more clinging to an I and mine."
Let me throw an analogy at you just because the abstract logic can get slippery. If we view the concept of the self not as a sturdy ancient oak tree, but as a ripple in a fast-moving stream, how can a ripple own the water?
It can't.
Right. The ripple is just a temporary dependent event. It's caused by the current pushing against a rock, combined with the wind, combined with the depth of the water.
It's an emergent phenomenon.
Yeah. It has no independent core, no svabhava to claim ownership of the river. It can't say, these water molecules are mine. When the current shifts, the ripple ceases to be.
That is an incredibly precise visualization. The ripple is a conventional reality. We aren't denying that you can see a ripple.
Right, you can take a picture of it.
You can point to it, you can photograph it, you can give it a name. But if you try to extract the ripple from the stream, the rocks, and the wind, you find nothing. It has no inherent independent existence separate from the conditions that cause it.
But logically, let me play devil's advocate here because this is the exact spot where my mind always rebels.
Please do.
If we completely eliminate the self and we eliminate mine, if we lay them to rest entirely, as verse 2 demands, who is the one left to experience this cessation?
Wow.
Right. If there is no me who is meditating, who gets liberated, am I just tricking myself into not existing?
I love that you brought this up because that panic is the ego's defense mechanism. Your mind is trying to sneak the self out the back door and dress it up in spiritual clothes. You are trying to create an enlightened ego to replace the suffering ego. And Nāgārjuna anticipates this exact evasion in step 3 of our framework. Let's look at verse 3, which is a massive counterintuitive leap.
Okay, lay it on me.
Strang's translation of verse 3 hits the nail on the head. He says, "He who is without possessiveness and who has no ego, he also does not exist. Whoever sees he who is without possessiveness or he who has no ego really does not see."
Whoa.
What Nāgārjuna is demonstrating is that these spheres are empty of inherent existence all the way down. The one who realizes there's no I or mine, the supposedly liberated person, the arhat, the enlightened being, also does not inherently exist.
Wow. So if I sit on a cushion for 10 years and finally achieve a state where I feel no attachment and I think to myself, I have achieved egolessness, I've completely failed.
You have missed the point entirely.
Because who's that I'm making that claim? Reifying a liberated person is just grasping at a new, shinier, highly subtle ego.
Precisely. There is no absolute opposition between the bound suffering person and the liberated enlightened person. You cannot pit samsara against nirvana as two inherently real opposing states.
They are both empty.
Yes. And verse 4 explains the actual mechanics of why realizing this emptiness is the only thing that stops the cycle of suffering.
Let's hear it.
Garfield translates verse 4 like this. "When views of I and mine are extinguished, whether with respect to the internal or external, the appropriator ceases. This having ceased, birth ceases."
Let's unpack the terms internal and external here. When I and mine stop, the very boundary between the inner world, the subjective observer, and the outer world, the objects being observed, completely vanishes. The X-ray machine analogy we started with, it isn't just that the machine is broken, it's that the distinction between the doctor, the machine, and the patient just collapses. And Nāgārjuna says this halts the appropriator, this halts upadana.
Let's spend some time on upadana because it is the engine block of the entire Buddhist conception of suffering.
It's a big word.
Huge. Upadana is grasping, clinging, the intense, thirsty acquisition of karma. It is the mind's desperate need to pull things across the boundary from the external world into the internal world to solidify the self.
Like, I need this car to be happy.
Or I need this person to love me. I need to reject this criticism.
So when you stop drawing a hard, inherently real line between what is in here and what is out there, there's physically nothing left to grasp at, and no independent entity left to do the grasping. The friction disappears. And according to verse 4, this stops the cycle of birth entirely.
Yes. But this immediately leads to the next massive pitfall.
There's always a pitfall.
Always. If you stop the boundary, if everything is empty of inherent existence, people immediately assume this is nihilism. They assume Madhyamaka is saying, nothing exists. We are just floating in a meaningless black void.
Right, which sounds terrifying. If I don't exist and my family doesn't exist, why shouldn't I just lie on the floor and stare at the ceiling until I die?
And that is exactly why we must logically move to step 4, inseparable interdependence. Nāgārjuna concludes that just because these three spheres, the owner, the ownership, the possessions, are empty of inherent existence, it does not mean they are non-existent.
Right, there's a difference.
A huge difference. Instead, they are inextricably linked. They are dependently co-originated, interdependent, co-defined, co-emergent, and co-evolving.
I want to make sure I'm explaining this clearly for you listening, because this is the massive aha moment of Madhyamaka.
Yes, it is.
The emptiness of the self doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything is happening concurrently. You cannot have the concept of an actor without an action. You can't have an owner without possessions. They literally birth each other conceptually.
Think of the concepts of left and right. Does left exist inherently in the universe?
No.
Right? If I am facing north, west is to my left. If I turn around and face south, east is to my left. Left only exists in dependent relationship to right and to the observer.
They co-define each other.
They are entirely imputed by the mind. They are designations, names, conventional truths used as navigational tools. But if you search the universe for the absolute essence of left, you will find a void.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The owner and the possession are like left and right. They are completely devoid of a solid, independent core. They are just relationships.
This is the radical genius of Madhyamaka philosophy. Emptiness and dependent origination are not two different things. They are two sides of the exact same coin, which logically necessitates step 5, the union of the two truths.
Let's dive into that. In the academic notes, this is often abbreviated as U2T, the union of two truths. It describes the relationship between conventional truth and ultimate truth.
The relationship is bidirectional. In mathematical logic, we represent this with a double arrow. The implies and is implied by symbol. Dependent origination, which is conventional truth, the everyday world of cause and effect, implies emptiness.
Right.
If a thing depends on other things to exist, like the ripple in the stream, it is inherently empty of its own independent existence.
And it works in reverse. Emptiness implies dependent origination.
Exactly. Because things are empty of a fixed, rigid, unchanging essence, they are fluid enough to interact. If you had a permanent, unchanging self, you could never learn, you could never heal from trauma, you could never even digest your food.
Wow.
Emptiness is what allows the dependent, conventional world to function. If things weren't empty, reality would be frozen solid.
Let me use the ultimate conventional tool as an analogy: money. A $100 bill is completely empty of inherent value. It's a piece of cotton blend with green ink on it.
Yep.
If I drop it in front of a squirrel, the squirrel doesn't care. Its value is entirely dependently originated. It requires a government, a banking system, and our collective psychological agreement.
It's an empty convention.
But conventionally, if I give it to a grocer, I can walk out with real food that stops my hunger. The union of these two truths is recognizing that the money is an empty illusion, but respecting the conventional reality enough to use it to buy dinner.
That perfectly captures step 6 in verse 5. Because these spheres rely entirely on this interdependence, they have the exact ontological status of illusions.
Right.
The traditional texts say phenomena are like illusions, reflections, mirages, dreams, and echoes. They are there, yet not there.
Let's really scrutinize the translation nuances for verse 5, because this verse exposes the literal mechanics of human suffering. How does this illusion cause us pain?
Okay, let's look at it.
Padmakara translates it like this. Release occurs when action and defilement cease. Actions and defilements are derived from thoughts, and these come from the mind's construction. Emptiness is what arrests them.
The fulcrum of this entire verse rests on the Sanskrit word prapanka. Translating this word is notoriously difficult, and seeing how the different scholars handle it is incredibly revealing.
So what do they use?
Padmakara calls it the mind's construction. Garfield translates it as mental fabrication. Strang uses a highly philosophical term, phenomenal extension, and Stephen Batchelor calls it fixations.
Why are they so wildly different? Let's put these translators in a room together. Why does Batchelor call it a fixation while Garfield calls it a fabrication?
Because they're trying to capture different aspects of a psychological spiral. Fabrication implies that the mind is actively building something fake, a false narrative.
Okay.
Fixation, on the other hand, implies the sticky, obsessive quality of the mind. Prapanca is conceptual proliferation.
Cool.
It is the mind's tendency to take a single neutral sensory input and detonate it into a massive, agonizing narrative.
Okay, I have the perfect, embarrassing, real-world example of Prapanca.
Please share.
You send a text message to a friend asking if they want to get dinner. 2 hours go by, no reply. The neutral, conventional reality is simply, no data has been received.
That is the fact.
But what does the mind do? The mental fabrication begins. They are ignoring me. They are mad about what I said last week. They've always secretly hated me. I am fundamentally unlovable and I will die alone.
There it goes.
You take a non-event and extend it phenomenally into an existential crisis. That is Prapanca.
Yes. And what Nāgārjuna is saying in verse 5 is that the direct realization of emptiness is the only thing that arrests that conceptual proliferation.
Because it stops the narrative.
Exactly. When you realize that the I who is supposedly unlovable and the friend who is supposedly judging you are both just dependent ripples in a stream, the narrative loses its fuel. It stops the echo chamber.
But wait, let me push back because this is where the philosophy meets the pavement.
Okay.
If my entire karmic reality is there, yet not there, like an echo or like a mirage, does that mean my suffering is completely imaginary?
Oh.
If I get hit by a car or if I lose someone I love, does this philosophy just pat me on the head and say, don't worry, it's just a mirage? Because that sounds incredibly dismissive of real human agony.
That is an exceptional challenge, and it requires absolute precision to answer. The pain is conventionally real. Madhyamaka does not deny conventional reality.
Right.
If you are dying of thirst in the desert and you see a mirage of a lake, the mirage does not quench your thirst. The physiological agony of your dehydration is very real. But what happens when you don't know it's a mirage?
You sprint toward it.
You exhaust your final reserves of energy chasing an illusion, which accelerates your death.
Oh, I see.
The realization that the water is a mirage doesn't stop your physical thirst, but it stops you from running yourself to death.
Right.
It stops the prapanca, the behavioral fixation, the desperate grasping that amplifies basic pain into overwhelming, complex, existential suffering.
The pain still burns, but you stop pouring gasoline on the fire.
Exactly.
Okay, but if human language itself is the primary engine of this conceptual proliferation, if the very words I use to describe my feelings are prapanca, how can the Buddha, or Nāgārjuna, use language to teach this? Which brings us to the next massive conceptual hurdle, step 7, the exhaustion of language.
We are moving into verses 6, 7, and 8. To dismantle the trap of language, Nāgārjuna uses a generalized tetralemma. He affirms that the three spheres are not this, they are not non-this, they are not both, and they are not neither.
And crucially, there is no secret fifth possibility.
Right. Their true nature is completely beyond conditioned, dualistic, conceptual proliferation. It shatters all of our linguistic models, all the dyads and triads.
But wait, if language completely fails, look at verse 6. Batchelor translates it. It is said that there is a self, but non-self too is taught. The Buddhas also teach there is nothing which is neither self nor non-self. Hang on. The Buddha literally taught thousands of people. He taught that there is a self, and then he taught there is no self. Why would an enlightened being blatantly contradict himself on the fundamental nature of reality?
Because the Buddha was not a philosopher trying to build an airtight, objective description of the universe. He was a physician trying to cure a disease.
Oh.
The teachings are upaya, skillful means. They're temporary adapted antidotes, not absolute dogmas.
It's like prescribing medicine. If I come to the doctor and I am violently shivering from hypothermia, the doctor prescribes a heating blanket. But if another patient comes in suffering from heat stroke, the doctor prescribes an ice bath.
Right. Opposite treatments.
If you view them as absolute dogmas, the doctor is contradicting himself. But if you view them as medicine, it makes perfect sense.
Exactly. The Buddha uses the medicine of no self to cure a person who is infected with the disease of an eternal ego and who is suffering from selfishness, pride, and grasping. But what happens once the patient is cured of that pride?
Well, you don't want them getting addicted to the medicine of no self. Because if you cling to no self as an absolute reality, you fall into nihilism, depression, and you basically stop caring about ethics. So the doctor has to take the medicine away too.
Precisely. Language is just the prescription. It is not the health itself.
Yeah.
And verse 8 maps this progression of temporary antidotes perfectly. Garfield translates it. Everything is real and is not real, both real and not real. Neither real nor not real. This is Lord Buddha's teaching.
Walk me through that progression. How does a teacher use those four corners as medicine?
Well, the Buddha teaches that everything is real to ordinary people who need to be grounded in ethics, who need to understand that their actions have real karmic consequences.
Okay, that's the first step.
Then he teaches that things are unreal to practitioners who are overly attached to materialism and need to loosen their grip on wealth or status. He teaches both real and unreal to advanced students who can handle the union of two truths, conventional versus ultimate, and he teaches neither real nor not real to the most advanced practitioners who are ready to drop all conceptual crutches entirely and directly experience reality. It depends entirely on the student's specific delusion.
Which culminates in verse 7, where language finally exhausts itself. Padmakara translates it. All that can be said is halted, for all that can be thought is halted. Not arisen and not ceased, the nature of phenomena is like nirvana. The true nature of phenomena, what the text calls dharmata, is already like nirvana.
When you halt the domain of conceptual thought, you stop forcing reality into boxes of arising and ceasing. You realize that because everything is dependently originated, nothing ever truly begins or ends in an absolute sense. It just continuously transforms.
Okay, I have a massive logistical question here.
Let's hear it.
If we cannot rely on language, if all our models of self and emptiness are just temporary medicine to be thrown away, and if true reality cannot be thought or spoken, what exactly am I supposed to do tomorrow morning?
That is the big question, isn't it?
Right. Do I just sit against a blank wall in silence forever? How do I navigate a society built entirely on conventional labels?
This is the critical transition from theory to practice. This is step 9, walking the middle way. The framework tells us that the only functional attitude toward the three spheres, actor, action, result, is a path entirely free from the extremes of this and non-this, but it's also free from the middle ground of both or neither.
Now, the outline of the text gives us a brutal list of philosophical extremes we have to transcend. It says we are moving beyond objectivism and realism on one side and subjectivism, idealism, solipsism, and nihilism on the other.
Very dense.
But it also says we must transcend relationism and processism, dualism and pluralism, and even monism and radical oneness. Okay, time out. You just threw a philosophical dictionary at me. We need to break these isms down because otherwise it's just academic name-dropping. Let's start with processism. What is that and why is it a trap?
Good catch. Processism is a highly sophisticated philosophical trap.
Yeah.
When people first learn about Buddhist impermanence, they realize there are no solid nouns in the universe. There's no solid tree, just a process of a seed becoming a sapling, becoming wood, becoming ash.
Yeah, that's all moving.
So they decide reality is made entirely of verbs. Everything is just a process. But processism becomes a trap when you reify the process itself as an absolute independent reality.
Oh, I see.
You replace a solid noun with a solid verb, but you are still clinging to a concept. The middle way says even the process is dependently originated and empty.
Okay, that makes sense. You can't grasp the verb any more than the noun. What about radical oneness or monism? So much of modern spirituality is based on the idea that we are all one. We're all drops in the same cosmic ocean. Why is Nāgārjuna attacking oneness?
Because positing an absolute universal one is still a dualistic conceptual extreme. If you assert that there is a giant singular oneness, you are logically implying a boundary between the one and the many.
Right.
You're creating a giant cosmic ego. It's just subjectivism blown up to the size of the universe. The middle way transcends even the concept of oneness. Reality isn't two, but it isn't one either.
Right. Non-dual literally means not two. It purposefully doesn't say one. It just negates the division.
Exactly.
So how do we actually live in a non-dual reality?
This brings us to step 10. Conventional tools and acting without acting. Verses 9 and 10 give us the pragmatic application. The conclusion is that we must use these dualities, cause and effect, subject and object, mean you. They are immensely useful, necessary tools to navigate the world. You cannot buy groceries without subject and object.
But the key is how we use them.
Yes. We must use them without attachment, without reification, without the desperate effort to make them absolute. We use the tools while simultaneously knowing their true, empty nature.
So we engage with the convention while holding the ultimate truth.
Precisely. Look at String's translation of verse 9. not caused by something else, peaceful, not elaborated by discursive thought, indeterminate, undifferentiated. Such are the characteristics of true reality, or tattva.
And verse 10 builds on that. Whatever exists, being dependent on something else is certainly not identical to that other thing, nor is a thing different from that, therefore it is neither destroyed nor eternal. Let me give a very grounded example of what I think this looks like in practice. Let's say I am leading a massive, high-stakes project at work, or I'm setting a very difficult boundary with a toxic family member. I still have to use the labels me and my project or my emotional boundaries.
They have to function.
Right. I have to write emails. I have to argue for a budget. I have to communicate clearly. I navigate the conventional world perfectly. I don't just act like a jellyfish.
Right, you engage fully.
But the difference is the internal mechanics. I know that the me, the project, and the company are just temporary, interdependent, conventional echoes. If the project ultimately fails, or if the family member gets angry, I am not existentially crushed.
You aren't destroyed.
My core isn't shattered because I never believed the project was a solid, inherent part of my soul to begin with. I act, I put in the effort, but without the desperate, thirsty clinging that generates karma. I am acting without acting.
That is the exact description of profound freedom. You are deeply engaged with conventional reality. In fact, you're probably more effective at your job because you aren't blinded by panic and ego, but you are not bound by it because you constantly perceive its empty nature.
Which naturally drives us to our final destination. Step 11 of our framework. We've done all this deconstruction. We've thrown away the self, the aggregates, language, and all the ginisms. What does reality actually look like when the cycle of bondage finally transforms into the realization of awakening?
The final logical conclusion of Nāgārjuna's entire analysis is breathtaking.
Yeah.
Because absolutely everything is empty of inherent existence, and because absolutely everything is independently originated. We might as well perceive everything as primordially equal. Pure, perfect, complete, divine.
Just exactly as it is.
It is one, but again, one in the non-dual sense, not many, not one, not both, not neither.
This is what the texts mean when they talk about abiding in reality exactly as it is, abiding in suchness.
Yes. Let's read verse 11, which Garfield translates as, "By the Buddhas, patrons of the world, this immortal truth is taught, without identity, without distinction, not non-existent in time, not permanent."
The immortal essence of reality is without singleness or multiplicity. It just is.
Yes.
And that drops us into verse 12, which I think is arguably the most empowering, radical verse in the entire text. Batchelor translates it, "When perfect Buddhas do not appear, and when their disciples have died out, the wisdom of the self-awakened ones will vividly arise without reliance."
The term there is Buddhas, the self-enlightened ones. This verse is asserting something phenomenal about the nature of the universe. It is saying that even if the historical Buddha was completely forgotten, even if every book of Buddhist philosophy burned and every monk and disciple died out, the exact same wisdom would spontaneously arise again in the minds of individuals who simply observed reality closely enough.
I love this so much. Why? Because this isn't an invented religion. It's not a fabricated doctrine or a fragile myth that requires a priesthood to pass it down through generations. It is the fundamental physics of reality.
Like a natural law.
It's like gravity. If we lost all the textbooks on gravity, eventually someone dropping an apple would mathematically figure it out again. Emptiness and dependent origination are accessible to absolutely anyone with awareness who is willing to ruthlessly analyze the nature of their own mind.
It is intrinsically verifiable. The true nature of reality is always here, always now. The union of the two truths, the profound interdependence of the conventional mirage, and the ultimate emptiness is the very fabric of the moment you are currently experiencing.
I just marvel at the sheer scale of what Nāgārjuna has done here in 12 verses. What stands out to you listening to this? For me, it completely obliterates my mental geography.
Oh, absolutely.
It means samsara, the world of suffering, and nirvana, the world of liberation, aren't two different places. You don't have to escape this broken, painful world to somehow find a perfect, peaceful one sitting on a cloud in another dimension.
Right. There is no escape hatch.
The cycle of creation, bondage, and awakening is a centerless, fractal dance happening right here, right now, in the very structure of the anxiety you felt this morning.
That is the ultimate takeaway of the middle way. Liberation isn't a destination. It isn't a place you go. It is a way of seeing where you already are. It is the cessation of the prapanka, the conceptual proliferation that obscures the primordial equality of the present moment.
Let's do a quick synthesis of this massive intellectual journey we've just taken. We started by identifying the mind's favorite trap, the triad of the actor, the action, and the result.
Hmm.
We dismantled that trap using the four corners of the tetralemma, logically proving that the self and its possessions cannot inherently exist. We crossed the terrifying void of emptiness only to discover the incredibly vital web of inseparable interdependence.
The left and right.
Yes, the left and right. We arrived at the union of two truths, learning that our conventional reality is exactly like a mirage. It is there, yet not there. We saw how the Buddha used language itself merely as a temporary medicine to cure extreme views, and we learned how to practically walk the middle way, acting passionately in the world without being desperately attached to the outcomes.
And finally, we arrived at suchness, the spontaneous, primordial equality of this exact second in time.
It is a total deconstruction of the ego, followed by a total reconstruction of a fluid, compassionate reality.
It leaves you with absolutely nothing solid to hold on to, which, paradoxically, is the exact definition of true freedom.
So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you transition back into the conventional world. Think back to that diagnostic X-ray analogy we started with.
The broken arm.
The ego wants that X-ray. It wants a solid white bone of reality it can point to and control. But as we've seen, the X-ray isn't broken. It's just a machine trying to photograph a mirage. The machine is doing its job, but the solid reality we're desperately looking for was never there to begin with.
It was an illusion of the lens.
Exactly. So if the one who realizes there is no ego is also just a conceptual illusion, and if liberation isn't some final trophy to be achieved, but rather a continuous, gentle letting go of rigid ideas, what concept are you rigidly holding on to right now that is quietly manufacturing your own suffering?
Good question.
What solid bone are you desperately trying to X-ray in your life? Because if you just let go of the camera and drop the need for certainty, you don't disappear into nothingness. You just join the dance.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
We'll see you next time.